and welcome to part 5 of this Talos enablement series. This time we're going to be talking about using Talos and templates. So we're going to talk about how you go about creating a template from an existing configuration set. We're going to talk about what we mean by scopes and tagging. We're going to edit a template and source different middlewares to see different views. We're going to create some variables and reuse existing variables. We're going to talk about how you go about identifying what configuration you should include in a template, and then versioning, and lastly, converting templates. So when you create a template, it started from the middleware instance. You simply, underneath the middleware, there's a template section, and you just click New, and then uh, add the type of template that you're using. So in this example, it's a Web2 application server, but it could be JBoss, it could be F5 Big IP, whatever the template type is, that's what you should be creating. So the template editor is then opened, and you see that configuration from that middleware graphically. You give the template a name, and you select items from the list to include in the template. So the template editor is broken down into several parts. Along the top, there's a filter and search function. That's particularly useful for finding pieces of configuration that you know you want, you know are going to be different, contain values that are obvious to you, so you can search for those values and it will restrict what's brought back in the config editor. The config editor itself, which just contains everything until it's filtered in some way. And then at the bottom, a variables section. So whenever you create a variable, that's where that variable will go, and you will see values here that are relevant to that variable in different environments. So in the configuration editor, configuration items are grouped into relevant sections that should make it relatively intuitive for you to find the parts that you need. So for example, Java process def here is underneath server, and Java virtual machine is underneath Java process def. So you should be able to find those values relatively quickly. And you simply just check the items that should be included in the template. Here, a box with a tick in it means it's included in the template. A blue box simply means that something underneath that level has been selected. So if you check a top level item, then everything underneath that item would be selected. So for example, it wouldn't be a great idea to go and just click the server level and select everything that comes underneath server, because it's going to include a load of configuration that you don't necessarily need in your template. You can filter what's visible as down to just what's selected, so you can get a cleaner view of your configuration that you've selected, or you can show all. And you can highlight just the variables, so just the items against which you have created variables, you can just show those values. Now, scopes, each element in the template has a scope associated with it. And there might be multiple instances of a particular element. So for example, HA Manager Service here, there's 3 elements against that. There's one for the deployment manager, one for cluster member 1, and another for the node agent. And they're the specific elements for those specific scopes. Now, adding a piece of configuration to a scope will, when applied, write that configuration to all members of that scope level. So for example, if you create a piece of configuration against a node scope, and you have 6 nodes in your environment, then when you apply that configuration, that node level configuration will be applied to every node by default. So there are pros and cons to doing that. There might be situations where you don't want that to happen. Um, you know, maybe each node needs a different value, and you you want to identify those differences, or perhaps only two of your six nodes need a particular value. Um, so if that's the case, then you can use tagging to do that. So you can set a role tag. For example, here we're doing this on the cluster member level. So if we had a piece of configuration we were applying to cluster member one and it wasn't role tagged, then that piece of configuration would also apply to cluster member two. If we set a role tag, then we can set configuration to only be applied to scopes with that tag. So you can create the configuration on the tag and not on the scope. This is useful where, for example, if in these two cluster members, um, one one cluster member is talking to one database, one cluster member is talking to another database, for example, you could separate out those configurations by using tagging. When you're creating a topology, there's a button right there in the topology editor to auto tag the topology. This is quite useful in large topologies where tagging individual items could, you know, take a long time and could be problematic. Um, so by default, it will tag all nodes and all clusters, um, because they're most likely to need that level of individual configuration. So once you've created a template, you can save it. You can go back in at a later date and edit that template. So the default view when you do that is to show only the template. So this item here, select source middleware. If that says select source middleware, then there is no source middleware assigned to it. So the only configurations that will be visible will be those that have been added to the template. You can select to source a different middleware, which will then allow you to view that template within the context of another middleware. So you could view it within the context of dev, and then view it within the context of QA or production. Um, and there might be situations where there are new configurations that didn't exist within dev that do exist perhaps within QA. So you can create your template in dev and then source the middleware from QA and add those extra configurations that didn't exist. So templates can and should really be layered um, to, uh, to build up a full configuration set. Um, Generally, you should try and keep your templates as small and specific as possible. So I like to have one template, say, for general configuration. So for you know, corporate compliance type configuration settings, like where do you keep your log files? How often do your log files roll over? Um, that level of level of configuration. Maybe you'd want a separate one for security configuration. So what Active Directory am I connecting to, and what are my credentials for accessing that? And then maybe one for each of your applications, um, so that you can keep those modular to a certain extent. There's good reasons for doing this, and it's very difficult and very complex to create one large template that's going to model your whole your whole cell. It's a lot of time and effort to do one thing, and then a whole load of places where it can go wrong. So if you try and keep them as small and specific as possible, then if there is an error, then it's easier to track down. If you ever want to take an application out of your existing cell, put it in a different cell, that's easier to do because you've got just that one application templated. There's lots of reasons for doing that. So when you add configuration elements to a template, you have the option to create variables from that configuration element. This means that this value is going to change between environments. So there's a button on the right-hand side of every element that gives a drop down, and you can either create a variable or link to an existing variable. So you should call the name something specific when you're creating a variable, something that's going to be is going to make sense when you're looking at it outside the context of the the configuration editor, because that's not always going to be there. Perhaps you're going to be just in the template view with just the variables visible, and so you want to know what that variable is without having to go and reference it somewhere. Where there are values that contain perhaps static information, you can customize the variable replacement. So in this example, we've got the value here that's being replaced is a WebSphere variable called user install root, and then slash a log location, so slash logs. So if you remove from the value section anything that you want to remain static, then that will automatically place it in the variable replacement box. So in this instance, we've removed everything before the word logs in the value section. And by doing that, it's inserted into the variable replacement entry the user install root slash that existed before. And the only part that it will be changing between environments is that variable log root section. So once you've created a variable, you can then reuse that variable for other variable entries that you want to create. So you don't have to keep creating multiple variables with the same value. And to do that, you use the link to existing variable function. So you click link to existing variable, you get a pop-up box which lists all the variables that you've already created, and then you can select that variable to use, and it will use that without having to create another. You then obviously you have further opportunity at that point to customize the replacement. So if you do need any static values before or after that variable replacement, then you've got the opportunity to do that then. So when you're adding items to a template, deciding which items need to be included and which items you should leave out can be a little tricky sometimes. Um, Obviously, as you use the tool, it will become more and more obvious which ones you should use. But there's some typical uh, some typical things you might look out for. So in sort of general baseline configurations, you might be looking at log directories, JVM arguments, heap sizes, environment variables, PKI monitoring settings, things like that. Um, they're the kind of items you need to look out for. In security, obviously you're going to be talking to an Active Directory or an LDAP server. So the server that you're talking to is probably going to change between environments, certainly between dev and prod. Any SSO configuration or SSL configuration, that's likely to have changes in there. And at the application level, configuration that's specific to a specific application. So the cluster member that it's being deployed to, JVM arguments, heap sizes, queues, queue managers. These are all things that will sort of leap out as being changeable in those environments. So in identifying configuration to template, you can try firstly looking at, is the environment documented? There's an awful lot of environments where the only reference to the configuration required to support a particular application is in documents on a SharePoint or something like that. So that would be a good port of call to go and find out what those configuration items are to change for that application or cell. Um, Secondly, you can compare with a blank cell. So you can go into compare mode, compare uh, your full export from your existing configured middleware with a blank cell of that blank middleware, and that will highlight those areas that are different between environments or specific to that application. So failing that, the kind of last port of call is simply add as much as you can find in terms of the configuration through compare mode or through documentation, and try it. Just build out the process and run the configure, and then troubleshoot the result. If the application isn't right, if it's not talking to a database, if it's not uh, if it's looking for a queue that isn't there, then obviously they're indicators that some configuration has been missed. So as well as being able to add a template to middleware, you can also associate a middleware with the template. You can do it kind of both ways around. I mean, they both do the same thing, but sometimes you're doing it the other way around. Sometimes you're in the templates view and you want to just add a middleware environment to that template. So when you edit the template, you get the opportunity to update the version. Um, and Ideally, you want to try and keep this in line with releases. So if you have a release of version 22 of your application, then creating a template version 22 of the configuration that goes alongside it is quite a good idea because then you can match up those two. Now, templates can be converted from one middleware type to another. Now, it can't do all middleware types. It can do some to some others. For example, you couldn't convert a WebSphere application server template to a IBM Data Power template. It's not the same thing. But one popular one is WebSphere application server to Liberty. Liberty is a more lightweight Java runtime than WebSphere application server, but they still run uh, you know, Java, uh, you know, Java packages. So you can the transform process takes elements from the WebSphere application server and creates a dictionary to be able to mimic that same configuration in Liberty. It's a different way of doing it. It's all XML file based. It's not uh, configuration in the same way as WebSphere application server, but you can mimic the same result. Um, and so you obviously need a template to start off with, a WebSphere application server template, and you get the transform to button and you click Liberty and it will create you a Liberty version of that template. Um, Now, there may not be 100% coverage on all of these configuration items. There are some configuration items that are just not convertible. There are just no equivalents uh, in Liberty for some things in Web Application Server. But we think it covers the vast majority, and for anything that there isn't coverage for in that transformation, tickets can be raised, and we can react fairly quickly to those.